you know, an ancient book, preserved for thousands of years, holds secrets that the world has yet to fully uncover. The Ethiopian Bible is not merely an ordinary scripture. It is the key that opens the door to prophecies and mysterious historical events that few dare confront. These books, long hidden and forgotten over time, are slowly being revealed, raising profound questions about faith and the power of humanity. If the secrets within the Ethiopian Bible were widely acknowledged, could they change the way we perceive this world? With each page that is turned, the story of the past, the mysterious connections between civilizations, and signs of an unpredictable future gradually become clearer. While many hesitate to face the uncomfortable truths that this book brings, a few recognize that this is the time to reevaluate and understand the roots of our faith more deeply. But is the world brave enough to explore what lies hidden in the Ethiopian Bible, where truths could change everything? If the information we've shared holds value for you, please share it with your Christian community. Support us by subscribing, and leave a comment below to share your thoughts. Why did religious leaders decide to ban the Ethiopian Bible? And what do they fear if its secrets are revealed? The Ethiopian Bible, a book containing profound and ancient secrets, is not only a treasure of religious knowledge, but also a significant part of human history. However, for centuries, this book has been banned by religious and political leaders within the Christian world, not just because of its historical events, but also due to its mystical content and strange teachings. So why would a book of such sanctity and importance be forbidden? What do religious leaders fear if the secrets within the Ethiopian Bible are exposed? As early as the 4th century, when Christianity officially became the state religion of the Roman Empire, religious councils began to remove books that did not align with Orthodox teachings. The Ethiopian Bible, which contains 81 books, is not merely a collection of familiar scriptures, but also includes sacred texts not recognized by the councils, such as the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees. Specifically, the Book of Enoch describes fallen angels and the relationship between these angels and humanity, a concept that Orthodox sects found too mystical and incompatible with the image of a singular, all-powerful God. These ideas threaten to disturb doctrines concerning sin, salvation, and holiness. One of the main reasons the Ethiopian Bible was banned is that it is not just a religious text, but a timeless repository of knowledge. Scholars believe many parts of the Ethiopian Bible contain guidance on astronomy, strange prophecies about the future, and discoveries that modern science has yet to explain. If this knowledge were widely revealed, it could change how humanity understands the universe, the existence of supernatural beings, and the nature of mankind. This would certainly undermine the current beliefs in existing doctrines. The fear among religious leaders is not only the loss of control over religious belief, but also a threat to their political power. The stories in the Ethiopian Bible are not merely teachings, but also descriptions of cosmic phenomena, great floods, and mysterious images that Orthodox churches cannot explain. These stories could spark curiosity among the faithful, leading them to question and doubt the answers provided by traditional doctrines. According to some studies, only about 10% of the global population is aware of the existence of the Ethiopian Bible and its secrets. Since its ban, this book has been hidden in the remote monasteries of Ethiopia, where only devout followers and scholars are allowed access. However, there are signs that parts of the Ethiopian Bible have been revealed to the outside world, and curiosity about the unknown content still persists. Religious leaders fear that if the Ethiopian Bible were to be widely recognized, its secrets would shake both the religious and scientific worlds. Stories of the union between angels and humans, forgotten kingdoms, and the appearance of mystical creatures would introduce entirely new concepts about the world. Could humanity accept these discoveries? Or would they collapse the foundations the churches have built over the centuries? They also fear that if the secrets of the Ethiopian Bible were exposed, it would alter how humanity views religious history, angels, demons, and perhaps even the very nature of mankind. This would open doors to deeper exploration of a world previously unknown to us. The Ethiopian Bible, therefore, is not just a sacred book, but also an unsolved mystery. In the history of religion, one of the most contentious confrontations has been between the Ethiopian Bible and the Orthodox Christian denominations. This conflict is not merely a debate over the number and content of sacred books, but also a reflection of profound differences in religious beliefs and theology. The Orthodox denominations, particularly the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, have upheld a Bible consisting of 66 books, while the Ethiopian Bible contains 81 books, many of which were excluded by Western churches due to differing doctrines and religious views. But why are these differences so significant to the development of Christianity? The Ethiopian Bible also contains mythological stories and prophecies that Western churches find difficult to explain or accept. Doctrines of rebirth, the interaction between the human world and the angelic realm, and descriptions of the end times have raised deep concerns. A prominent example is the Book of Enoch, which reveals the buried secrets of the universe and prophecies about the apocalypse. These elements not only create theological differences, but also raise questions about the authority of the church in shaping the faith of believers. Are they hiding secrets that could change humanity's understanding of heaven and hell? These differences are not merely a debate over texts. They represent a struggle for power and influence within the religious world. The Orthodox Church seeks to control the manner and content of faith, while the Ethiopian Bible, with its mystical books, reflects a broader view of the relationship between humanity and God, between the material and the supernatural. This distinction not only mirrors a historical confrontation, but also impacts the development and understanding of faith in subsequent eras. The teachings of the Ethiopian Bible have existed in a religious space of their own, changing how people understand salvation and the soul. This has prompted great questions about theological authority and the secrets that the Western Church may not want to acknowledge. This confrontation continues to this day, highlighting the conflicts in religious beliefs and theology between Christian sections, and is a crucial part of the formation of Christianity as we know it today. The Ethiopian Bible is not merely a book. It is a symbol of resistance and the defense of religious identity. The differences in religious beliefs and theology between the Ethiopian Bible and the Orthodox Christian denominations not only reflect the diversity in faith, but also underscore the importance of safeguarding religious freedom and the right to delve deeper into the mysteries of the universe. This controversy and its far-reaching influence have led to a relationship between Ethiopia and other Christian nations that is marked by differing perspectives. The question arises, what historical reasons led to this division, and how has it affected religious relations over the centuries? One of the most significant reasons for this separation stems from Ethiopia's early acceptance of Christianity, long before most other Christian nations. In the 4th century, when King Ezana of Aksum officially adopted Christianity as the state religion, Ethiopia became one of the first Christian nations in the world. However, as Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire and beyond, Orthodox churches began to form their own theological standards and doctrines along with this. Central religious councils, such as the Council of Nicaea 325, established which books would be included in the canonical Bible. Yet, the Ethiopian Bible preserved books that were excluded by the Orthodox churches, particularly the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, such as the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and others. The relationship between Ethiopia and the Orthodox Christian nations has been influenced not only by these differences in the Bible, but also by disputes over religious leadership. Ethiopia has maintained an independent ecclesiastical system, not entirely dependent on the Western churches. This has caused concern among other Christian nations regarding their influence over a mighty Christian nation like Ethiopia. While Ethiopia has kept good relations with many Christian nations, these differences have created barriers, particularly in recognizing the authority of the Pope and the influence of the Western churches. The differences in the Bible also have a profound impact on the relationship between Ethiopia and other Christian nations. While the Western churches regard the excluded books as apocryphal, Ethiopia considers them essential to their theological heritage. This defense is not only a struggle for religious power, but also a debate over the orthodoxy of the Christian faith. Other Christian nations have sometimes been cautious in their approach to Ethiopia due to this difference, even though they have maintained historical ties with the nation. Today, although Ethiopia and the Orthodox Christian nations have made strides toward reconciliation and building better relations, the differences in the Bible remain an integral part of Ethiopia's religious identity. This not only reflects a theological confrontation, but also affirms the right to religious freedom and the protection of the sacred values that Ethiopia has preserved for centuries. The relationship between Ethiopia and other Christian nations continues to evolve. Yet this separation remains a profound mark in the global history of religion. What sacred books does the Ethiopian Bible contain that are absent in other versions of the Bible? The Ethiopian Bible is a priceless treasure containing sacred books not recognized by the canonical Bibles of other Christian denominations. Below are some of the important sacred books within the Ethiopian Bible, each carrying a profound message and unique significance. The Book of Enoch, 1 Enoch. The Book of Enoch is one of the most prominent books in the Ethiopian Bible, a sacred text of great influence on the beliefs of the Ethiopian people. This book describes the journey of Enoch, a mystical figure believed to have been taken up to heaven by God without experiencing death. Through this, the Book of Enoch offers prophecies about the future, the judgment of God, and the coming of the Son of Man, Messiah, a Savior who will bring justice to the world. This book is not only a significant theological text, but also contains descriptions of angels and the supernatural realm, offering a deep insight into the cosmic forces that the Ethiopian people believe God governs. The Book of Jubilees, the Book of the Generations. The Book of Jubilees, also known as the Book of the Generations, is another canonical text in the Ethiopian Bible, originating from an early period in Israel's history. This book provides a detailed account of human history from the creation to the time of Moses. Though in a manner distinctly different from other biblical books, it divides history into jubilees, 49-year periods, each marking a cycle of divine intervention. The Book of Jubilees offers instructions on religious rites, festivals, and ethical regulations for the Israelite people, emphasizing the necessity of adhering to the covenants with God. This book holds particular importance for Ethiopians as it helps preserve their unique liturgical practices and doctrines through the centuries. 1 and 2 Maccabees. The books of 1 and 2 Maccabees tell the story of the Maccabean revolt against the Greek Empire in the 2nd century BC. This struggle was fought to preserve the religion and culture of Israel and marks a significant event in the history of the Jewish people. 1 Maccabees focuses on historical events, while 2 Maccabees provides moral and religious counsel. Both books emphasize the strength of faith and loyalty to God during times of great trials. The Book of Baruch. The Book of Baruch is considered a part of the Ethiopian Bible. It is traditionally attributed to Baruch, the disciple of the prophet Jeremiah, and reflects repentance and prayers for the redemption of the Israelite people during their exile. This book contains counsel on how to live according to God's will. as well as prophecies concerning the restoration of Israel. The Book of Judith. The Book of Judith tells the story of an Israelite heroine named Judith, who saved her people from the invading Assyrian army. Through this account, the book not only describes a great military victory, but also serves as a symbol of strength, loyalty, and faith in God. Judith's sacrifice and wisdom have become exemplars of virtue and courage in the defense of faith. The Wisdom of Solomon. The Wisdom of Solomon is a book in the Ethiopian Bible that contains teachings on wisdom, justice, and love. This book is not only valuable from a philosophical standpoint, but also reflects a harmonious blend of faith and reason, helping believers gain a deeper understanding of the nature of God and the laws of the universe. These books in the Ethiopian Bible not only offer profound religious narratives, but also impart unique teachings on faith, loyalty, and divine intervention in human life. They reflect the importance of preserving religious values through the centuries, affirming that salvation and justice will come to those who persist in faith and remain loyal to God. And there are many more sacred books within the Ethiopian Bible. Please subscribe to our channel to follow the next books we will share with you. The Ethiopian churches have not only preserved the Bible, but have also used it as a tool to strengthen faith and unite the community. From the monasteries in the highlands to the tremendous religious councils, the Bible has played a key role in preserving cultural values and traditions while also connecting the people to a mystical and revered past they hold dear. In the context of the modern world, the role of the Ethiopian Bible has become even more significant. It is not merely a religious heritage, but a bridge between the past and the present, between tradition and innovation. In exploring this sacred book, the Ethiopians find not only their faith, but also their cultural identity, history, and the values they continue to uphold and pass down through the generations. So, do the prophecies in the Ethiopian Bible have any connection to the events in human history? The prophecies in the Ethiopian Bible have long been a subject of curiosity and controversy, not only because of their mystical nature, but also due to their profound connection with the events in human history. Recorded in books such as the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, these prophecies are not merely predictions of the future, but also reflect the upheavals that have occurred in the past, forming a sturdy bridge between religious faith and global events. These stories can be seen as interpretations of historical events that have taken place, such as the fall of great empires. Scholars have pointed out that the tales of mighty empires like Assyria, Babylon, and later Rome bear striking similarities to the descriptions in the prophecies of the Book of Enoch. The eventual downfall of these powerful civilizations could be understood as part of God's divine judgment, as foretold. This raises an intriguing question. Could the Ethiopian Bible forecast significant events yet unknown to humanity? One such strange prophecy is the rise of the Ethiopian Empire, an independent empire with profound religious influence. Throughout the centuries, from the time of Aksum to the later kingdoms, the influence of these prophecies can be seen in the shaping of Ethiopia's national and religious identity. This theory is not merely a coincidence, but could be a part of how Ethiopian leaders relied on these prophecies to shape policy and confront external threats. However, the remaining question is, will humanity have the courage to face the truths the Ethiopian Bible presents? These prophecies not only contain warnings about downfall and sin, but also about salvation and hope, showing that change can come from righteous actions. Yet, this truth might compel us to confront difficult questions about existence, morality, and humanity's place in the universe. It can be said that the Ethiopian Bible, with its prophecies and predictions, serves as a mirror for humankind to reflect on past mistakes and look toward a brighter future. When speaking of the Ethiopian Bible, one cannot fail to mention the Kingdom of Aksum, one of the greatest civilizations in the history of East Africa. Aksum is renowned not only for its impressive architectural feats and transcontinental trade routes, but also for its decisive role in preserving and advancing the Ethiopian Bible. Around the 4th century AD, when Christianity was recognized as the state religion under the reign of King Ezana, Aksum became not only a religious center, but also a stronghold for safeguarding Ethiopia's unique religious values, particularly the Ethiopian Bible with its sacred books that other Christian denominations did not acknowledge. One of the most mystical stories associated with Aksum is its protection of the Ark of the Covenant, an artifact believed to contain a copy of the original covenant between God and the people of Israel. According to legend, the Ark was brought to Ethiopia from Jerusalem during the reign of King Menelik II, the son of Queen Sheba and King Solomon, carrying with it the preservation of the sacred teachings and prophecies found in the Ethiopian holy books. It is this veneration and protection of these sacred relics that helped Aksum become a symbol of loyalty to the original teachings. And the Ethiopian Bible has not only been preserved but also flourished throughout the centuries. During the height of the Aksumite kingdom, from the 5th to the 7th centuries, Aksum was not only a center of power but also a place where the union of religion and politics began. Kings of Aksum, such as King Ezana, used the preservation of the Ethiopian Bible as a tool to consolidate their power and legitimacy while simultaneously affirming Ethiopia's religious distinctiveness from other cultures. The preservation of copies of critical sacred texts helped Aksum become an indispensable part of spreading and safeguarding Ethiopia's religious values, thereby reinforcing the nation's religious and cultural identity. Today, as the world continues to evolve and seek out ancient cultural values, the Ethiopian Bible remains a vital force in preserving the religious heritage and history of a people. Without the kingdom of Aksum and the preservation and development efforts of generations of believers, the Ethiopian Bible might have been erased or forgotten long ago. Thanks to these efforts, Ethiopia's unique religious values continue to endure, inspiring and providing pride not only to the Ethiopian people, but to all who seek truth in the ancient sacred texts. The question of whether the Ethiopian Bible holds the key to understanding the common origins of religion and the development of human civilization has captivated scholars, theologians, and historians for centuries. Could this ancient text, with its unique and enigmatic sacred books, provide insight into the cultural and religious links between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Babylon? To answer this, we must delve into the historical, theological, and mystical connections that bind these ancient cultures together. One of the strongest connections between Ethiopia and ancient civilizations like Egypt and Babylon lies in the similarities found in their mythology and religious rituals. Both Egypt and Babylon were highly developed civilizations with religious systems that profoundly influenced surrounding cultures. The ancient Egyptian beliefs, with their complex pantheon of gods and the concept of the afterlife, bear striking similarities to themes found in the Ethiopian sacred texts. Similarly, Babylon's influence, especially in prophecy and divine judgment, is clearly reflected in the Ethiopian Bible, particularly in the Book of Enoch, which prophesies a great judgment and the ultimate triumph of good over evil. Historical events further reinforce the link between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Babylon. For example, the story of the Queen of Sheba, who visited King Solomon in Jerusalem, is integral to Ethiopia's identity. According to Ethiopian tradition, Sheba's kingdom spanned a vast region that included Egypt, suggesting that her interactions with Solomon may have been influenced by the political and religious dynamics of Egypt and Babylon. This interaction underscores Ethiopia's role as a cultural and religious crossroads, where the influences of Egypt and Babylon fused with local traditions to form a unique religious identity that endures to this day. Moreover, The numerous prophecies and divine revelations found in Ethiopian texts reflect elements found in Babylonian scriptures. The Book of Enoch, for instance, describes visions of heaven and angels that bear resemblance to divine beings in Babylonian religion. Scholars have pointed out that both civilizations shared a fascination with the cosmos, emphasizing divine judgment and the cyclical nature of time. These themes were not merely abstract concepts, but were woven into the very fabric of daily life, influencing politics, culture, and their understanding of the universe. While the evidence for these connections may never be fully confirmed, it is undeniable that Ethiopia's sacred texts preserve echoes of the ancient civilizations that shaped the course of human history. From Egypt's gods to Babylon's prophecies, the Ethiopian Bible contains a unique blend of religious thought and cosmic vision that may hold the key to unlocking the secrets of our shared spiritual heritage. As we continue to study and explore these sacred texts, one thing becomes clear. The connection between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Babylon is not just history. It is a sacred thread that continues to bind us together, inviting us to seek profound truths about our own existence. The Ethiopian Bible, with its profound prophecies and teachings, is an untapped spiritual treasure. If these texts were widely accepted and recognized within the global faith community, they could spark a revolution in belief, awakening humanity from long-held illusions. The teachings found in the Ethiopian Bible, particularly in the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, not only challenge our faith, but also reveal hidden truths about nature, the universe, and God's judgment. From these lessons, future generations of believers will learn that truth is not only something to be sought, but also the path to salvation. Humanity cannot remain forever in the darkness of misconceptions. Instead, it must step forward and confront the truth, no matter how difficult or challenging it may be. Ultimately, only by accepting and acting upon the truth that the Ethiopian Bible offers can one find true peace in the soul and in a relationship with God. Please subscribe to our channel to enjoy more captivating Bible stories from us.